Ortega. I am a board member for MRPI, which is the Migration and Refugee Policy Initiative, and I'm going to be the moderator for this event. It's my honor to present these panelists who have dedicated their professional and personal lives to give a voice to a society that has been silenced for 63 years. Especially now, where currently there's a major immigration crisis in Cuba. Since October last year, nearly 200,000 Cubans have reached the United States. These numbers are those reported in statistics. A year after the mass anti-government protests of July 11th. First, we have John Suarez. He is the current director for a Center for a Free Cuba. John has dedicated his career to expose the reality of totalitarian and authoritarian regimes, such as the one currently in Cuba. Professor Hector Chamis, who is a professor of the Latin American Studies at SFS. Professor Chamis just recently wrote an article for InfoBay on the reality of migrants, from those who cross the Darien to those who risk their lives at sea, and most importantly, putting accountability to governments who continue to allow for these mass migrations. And then we have Alian Collazo. He is the current director for the Cuban Freedom March. He, alongside his team, have led thousands of people to march for Cuba's freedom after the mass protests of July 11th. Alian believes that generating a general consensus on Cuba's current political, economic, and social state will advance freedom for Cuba. Now we have lawyer abogado Miguel Inda Romero, who has closely worked with migrants coming from the border. He does not charge a dime for his services. Also, Romero's father was also an ex-political prisoner from Cuba. Like my grandfather, Romero's dad served time in the UMAP concentration camps during the early years of the Cuban Revolution. So to get to this panel discussion, I want to start with the question that, why are we here? Why are we having this panel discussion? So, why are Cubans leaving Cuba? And I want to add to that. Are Cubans migrating or are Cubans fleeing Cuba? What are the differences between the two terms? And we can start with you, John.
Thank you, Angelica, and thank you for hosting this event. Thank you, Angelica. Thank you for hosting this event. Explaining Cuba's migration crises. Let's touch on what's going on now. First, to answer your question, Cubans are fleeing a dictatorship. Over 200,000 Cubans, if we count in the entirety of 2021 and through the present 2022, have fled the island. Now, what is the cause of this migration crisis, this latest one? Cubans are fleeing Cuba due to a double whammy. Massive political repression following nationwide protests in July 2021, and an economic crisis caused by failed communist central planning, generating hyperinflation in the island. Nevertheless, both increased repression and an economic downturn are not enough to explain the new outflow. Havana reasoned that it could weaponize migration from Cuba to the United States in order to generate a crisis to obtain concessions from Washington. They also had help from their ally, Daniel Ortega, in Nicaragua. Managua announced on November 22, 2021, that it would lift visa requirements for Cubans traveling to Nicaragua. Sebastian Arcos of Florida International University's Cuban Research Institute, in an interview with Jose Diaz-Balart back then in November of 2021, explained how this would open a new path for Cuban migrants to reach the United States and create an even greater crisis on the US-Mexican border. Mr. Arcos is not clairvoyant. Havana has successfully carried out these tactics repeatedly over the decades. Professor Kelly Greenhill, an associate professor at Tufts University, in her 2002 paper, Engineered Migration and the Use of Refugees as Political Weapons, described a pattern to use quote-unquote coercive engineered migration to create instability in the United States and gain leverage that was first established by Castro in the 1965 Camirioca crisis during the Johnson administration, repeated in 1980 with the Mariel crisis during the Carter administration, and again in 1994 during the Clinton administration with the Balceros crisis. In 2015, an air bridge was set up from Cuba to Central America for thousands of Cubans to travel to the United States-Mexican border, and over 123,000 Cubans entered the US during the Obama administration's 2014-2016 Cuba thaw. So what is it that makes Cuba different than other countries? Cuba is under communist rule. and that is the common denominator for regimes with huge outflows of their population. Political economist and demographer Nicholas Eberstadt, in his 2003 monograph, Population Aspects of Communist Countries, found one of the features of these regimes is that communist governance generates, quote, enormous streams of refugees, escapees fleeing from the new order, or driven out by some particular policy or practice promoted by the new regime. Cubans fled on rafts across the Florida Straits, in freedom flights, defected from sporting events, ballet troops defected in Paris, and today many fly to Nicaragua and trek through the hundreds of miles of jungle to the US-Mexican border. Not all of them make it. A 1995 monograph by academics Holly Ackerman and Juan Clark, The Cuban Balseros, Voyage of Uncertainty, reported that as many as 100,000 Cuban rafters may have perished trying to leave Cuba. And those are very old numbers. Millions fled communist rule in Cuba, but they were not alone. 2 million fled communist rule in the Soviet Union. 2 million Chinese fled to Taiwan to avoid communism in China. 12 million Germans fled to Austria and West Germany to avoid life under communism, and East Germany built the Berlin Wall to keep those still there from leaving. Millions fled from North Korea to South Korea after the 1945 partition. 2 million fled the arrival of communism in Ethiopia. More than 1 million South Vietnamese fled when North Vietnam took them over, imposing communism on the rest of the peninsula. And millions are also fleeing Venezuela today. Cuban migration is not static. There are moments when Havana allows Cubans to leave and encourages them to, as is taking place now. But at other times, the Castro regime shuts the door on the possibility of leaving. Like their East German counterparts, they use deadly force to stop them. In 1980, Fidel Castro began by insulting those seeking refuge as scum and worms, and took children and youth out of schools to take part in acts of repudiation. According to Carlos Alberto Montaner, the students killed a teacher that they had discovered running away. 40 Cubans who simply wanted to leave Cuba were lynched. In 1993, U.S. officials charged that Cuban Marine patrols repeatedly tossed hand grenades, strafed fleeing swimmers with automatic weapons fire, and recovered their bodies with gaff hooks within sight of the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. They were trying to swim from the Cuban side to the American side. On July 13, 1994, a group of Cubans tried to escape aboard the 13 de Marzo tugboat. State security forces and 4 transportation ministry boats intercepted the tugboat 7 miles off the coast of Cuba with water jets from pressure hoses, knocking people off the deck, tore the children from the arms of their mothers, and sank the tugboat. 37 people were murdered, 11 of them children. Yureneski Martinez Reina, age 28, was shot in the back and killed by State Security Chief Miguel Ángel Rio Seco Rodriguez in Matanzas, Cuba, on April 9, 2015, for peacefully trying to leave Cuba. A group of young men were building a small boat near the beach to flee the island when they were spotted and shot at by state security. Yuneski was left for 2 days in the lagoon before being found by his brother. This phenomenon is not due to economic sanctions, but a feature of communist rule. In 1962, President John Kennedy placed an economic embargo on Cuba. Over the next 30 years, the Cuban dictator ridiculed U.S. sanctions prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. I'm going to have 2 quotes from this handout that's been circulated. There are many more, but 2 that I wish to highlight are, in 1962, Fidel Castro, speaking at the first Congress of the Communist Party of Cuba in December 1975, bragged, at first the United States cancellations were quite annoying, but when luckily we did not depend on them for anything, neither in trade nor in supplies, nor in anything, if we are already victorious now after victory, what can they threaten us with? With canceling what? Fidel Castro, in an April 1985 Playboy interview, said, quote, "The United States has less and less to offer Cuba. If we could export our products to the United States, we would have to start making plans for new production lines. Because everything that we produce now and everything that we are going to produce in the next 5 years has already been sold to other markets. The socialist countries pay us much better prices and have much better relations with us than we have with the United States." Castro's annual campaign against the embargo at the UN General Assembly began in 1992, 30 years after the embargo was imposed on Cuba, when Soviet subsidies ended. But by then, there had already been several large-scale exoduses that could not be attributed to sanctions impacting the dictatorship. There is only one permanent solution to solve the Cuban migration crisis: an end to the communist dictatorship in Cuba via a transition to democracy and the rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. So Professor Tamiz, what are your takes on why are Cubans fleeing Cuba, as John mentioned?
Well, hi everyone. Thank you, Angelica. Thank you, everybody. Definitely. Cubans flee, Venezuelans flee, Nicaraguans flee because of deprivation and repression. In the particular case of Cuba, both have increased in the last few years. Deprivation because of an economic crisis of no precedent, where in the past it was the Soviet subsidy, then it was the Venezuelan subsidy in the form of oil, but it's not nearly enough anymore. And repression has intensified, as you all know, because Cuban civil society has taken to the streets, period, in ways that hadn't happened before, at least for quite some time. And this is the question of, I wrote something on Darien last weekend, on the Darien migration in Panama, and it was mostly following the article in the New York Times a week ago or so on the Darien, and they don't say anything about others. They all limit themselves to the Venezuelans, and true, they're a majority, but there are also Cubans, there are also Haitians, a good number of them. And this has become structural in our region. The reason is the same. Single party rule, the jure, as in Cuba, in the Constitution, or de facto, because that has been quite some time for export product, the single party rule, de facto in Nicaragua, or de facto in Venezuela, where party in power doesn't give up power, doesn't allow for clean elections, doesn't transfer power to another party ever. Even if in the Constitution is not like in Cuba, where if you read the recent constitutional reforms, totalitarianism has increased because now the party is the sort of creator. The party precedes the state, which is historically wrong for sure, but it also by itself is quite telling of the intellectual framework that operates there now. In other words, the totalitarian nature of the regime has intensified since the 2019, I think, is the last constitutional reform, right? And that has become sort of, if we put it in context, that has become the name of the game in several of our Latin American countries, which, while Nicaragua, Venezuela, Bolivia is probably going that way, enacting constitutional reforms that eliminate the possibility of alternation in power. And when there is no alternation in power, whether you like it or not, you're going to end up in a single party regime. People are fleeing, certainly. Again, let me say this in such big numbers. Venezuela reached yesterday officially, not yesterday, but officially, the information was provided, 7.1 million. That's about 25% of the Venezuelan population. And to give you an idea, because there are less Cubans on the run, but it's going that way as well. I don't know what percent of the population has reached, but it shouldn't be much lower than that 25%, especially because it's been an ongoing thing for many, many years. So that's one thing. I've written quite a bit on this issue of hegemonic single-party regimes, de jure Cuba or de facto, and Cuba has exported it, and via some reforms, via co-opting the electoral authorities, committing electoral fraud. That has been in other countries in Latin America normalizing single-party regime. That's why they're leaving. a word about the embargo, the blockade, and all of that. Of course, I don't need to tell you that there is no blockade, there is an embargo, and yet most of medicines and foodstuff imported by Cuba come from the US. No wonder. But this is I don't know, I always think that this is the most effective propaganda machinery ever, that we ever saw, read, or heard about. For 63 years talking about a blockade. The US embargo doesn't prevent Cuba from trading with other countries. It's just that it has certain regulations. Not that I am necessarily in favor of the embargo, but that's a different question. And this is oftentimes from the perspective of the dominant party, the reason is bogus, we know that. The reason is that the system is a failed system, is a system that does not allocate resources in any way efficiently, it's a system that does not promote work, does not promote a work ethic. Some Cuban friend once he told me, well, the thing about the Castro regime is that it has institutionalized the possibility of living a life without working. And well, if that is so, yeah, the economic crisis follows. One thing that has changed, though, I don't know, I'm going through your questions, Angelica, and I'm not necessarily in an organized way, but anyway. One thing that has changed is that the historic generation, Giovanni Sanchez always taught me about the historic generation. And she's the one I have to cite her, that the historic generation is passing, there's almost nobody left, and the new generation has no karma, no form of authority, no charisma whatsoever, and they're a bunch of bureaucrats. There is a sort of Sovietization of the Cuban Revolution, if you want. And Diaz-Canel is the epitome of the bureaucrat, the Communist Party nomenclatura. That has changed, and that's why people have begun 3-4 years ago screaming and insulting Diaz-Canel in public. And people have had access to technology that allow them to communicate, to advertise, to promote, and to let this know for the very first time. It's no little thing. The Arab Spring started with a phone outside Cairo, somebody taping a young guy who burned himself down in front of a city office where he was doing some trámite, for lack of a better word in English. And then July 11, I don't need to say much about it to you guys, but July 11, which is 2021, which is a landmark in Cuban history, which is a landmark in terms of civil society organization and cohesion. And that has shown how much things have changed. Patria y Vida coalesced all this. Patria y Vida provides, it's here, Angelica gave us this. Patria y Vida is sort of the equivalent to the Czech Spring, the Prague Spring, where artists, political movements don't do the job, politicians much less, especially these days. But artists do the job. And the Prague Spring was a generation of artists, poets, writers, novelists, and that captured the imagination of the people. And I think Patria y Vida captured the imagination not just of Cubans, but of people around the world. Se acabó, and all those things that it's been too long. And it's been too long. It's been too long in the sense that there's no way to justify 63 years of the same party in power, period. There's no way. Whatever you call that, socialist revolution, right, left, 63 years of the same people in power, the same bureaucracy. And let me tell you something. There's a lot of work to do. I remember in the 96, 98, something like that, Ricardo Lagos, at the time president of Chile, a socialist, said something like, there's no reason why Cuba cannot have a free, open, and competitive election. It's about time. I think that's a job for those who support Cuban liberation and who support Cuban democratization, to work with those well-intentioned left-wingers who are not Communist Party bureaucrats, who are lefty because, well, who wasn't lefty in its youth? But Cuban poverty, inequality, lack of rights, absolute lack of rights, is certainly not very consistent with any agenda of progress. And you cannot be a progressist without progress. And what's going on in Cuba is an absolute lack of progress. So I'm going to stop here because I don't want to extend myself much more, but that's pretty much my take on a few of your points, Angelica. Not all of them, certainly, because there are too many. So, sorry.
No worries.
Thank you so much.
No worries. We'll keep on the discussion. Alian, you're the director for Cuban Freedom March, and my admiration of what you've done. And we met over last summer on the march here in DC. So Professor has talked about, as John has talked about, in your terms of you meeting people who go to the march, what do they say to you? Why are they leaving Cuba? Why are they fleeing?
Well, first of all, thank you guys, and thank you, Angelica, for putting this together. My name is Alian Collazo. I was born in Cuba. Everything that they are talking about, I experienced. Next year would be 20 years since I left Cuba on a boat, on a 30-foot boat with 44 people in it, including a 7-month pregnant woman, and my young mother that was younger than I, taking her 8-year-old son out of Cuba. And when you live in Cuba, oftentimes, I met a marsher here in DC that he told me, I thought I was leaving Cuba because of the economic situation that I lived in. But when I got here and I got to see how the world is, and that I got to see what freedom encompasses, I realized that I left Cuba not because of the economic situation that I lived in. I left Cuba because I lacked absolute freedom to live. And I think that when we put into words the experience of the Cuban people, of the 200,000 that had just left, that are about 2% of the Cuban population, but of the millions that have left over the past 63 years, that is the core of why the Cuban people flee. It's about freedom. And sometimes people say, well, what does that mean? What are you talking about? Freedom can mean so many things. To the Cuban people, freedom means absolutely everything and absolutely nothing. And I say that because when you are in Cuba and you can barely subsist, let alone survive, you're only thinking about, what can I eat tomorrow? How can my children dress today? And you don't have the space necessary to think about the rights that you're missing out on. So when the Cuban people go out and they yell libertad, which they've been doing for the past week and a half, by the way, not just July 11th, they're asking for all-encompassing freedom because they, contrary to what we might believe, I don't think anyone wants to be born in a neighborhood, in a country, in a place, and all of a sudden, when you reach a certain age, decide that you want to leave everything behind to start again. No one wants to do that. So when you have to take that decision, it's because there's a big reason for it. So they are fleeing. And John and the professor have touched quite a lot on some of the reasons about that. But freedom is all-encompassing. The need for it is all-encompassing for the Cuban people. And last year, there were 10,000 people here in Washington, D.C., or maybe more, who marched from the White House to the Cuban embassy. And we proudly marched with them and led that march. But what you often see is that Cubans do want to have a future in Cuba. The Cuban diaspora that lives outside of Cuba, not just here in the United States, but across the world, because we have I've had the opportunity and the pleasure to travel to many places, and everywhere I go, I find either a Cuban cafe, or a Cuban this, or a Cuban that. We are everywhere. It's not by choice. It's because we've had to flee wherever we can go to have the opportunities to have opportunities. And I think that that's important to notate. The opportunities to have opportunities doesn't mean that Cuba, from one day to the next, will transition or ever be the type of society that the United States is. Because the United States is unique in its economic prosperity, resource, rich nation. But what it does mean is that the Cuban people will have the ability to choose their own future and then have opportunities in their own country. So we see the highest inflation rate in the world after Zimbabwe and Cuba. John Hopkins just released some numbers on the 4th of October where it's the second highest in the world, 202%. The Cuban peso has been at its lowest point to the dollar in its history. In the black market, where most Cubans have to buy their things, you're paying for $1, 200 Cuban pesos. And those figures are astounding. So that's a part of the equation of why Cubans are fleeing. I think that, to the point of Patria y Vida, there was a Cuba prior to July 11th, 2021, and there's a Cuba after July 11th, 2021. When I was an 8-year-old in Cuba, there were no cell phones in Cuba. There were cell phones in other places of the world, it was a new thing, but there were no cell phones in Cuba. But let alone just were there even cell phones, there were barely landlines. We had the lowest landlines amounts per capita in the world. And that was with a point. Fidel Castro's authoritarianism was all about keeping the Cuban people in a North Korean style seclusion from the outside world. When that fell apart, I always say I'm 27 years old. I'm proud of the generation of Cubans that are my age. Because last July 11th, the largest percentage of people out in the streets were people younger than me or not older than 45. And that has a lot to do with having access to information. When I was a kid in Cuba, I could only see 2 TV channels. One newspaper, that was the official newspaper. And I had a landline for my entire block that you could rarely call and that you knew that they were listening into. I mean, it was so controlled. But now that has, to an extent, changed. And that is the catalyst that will lead to this that we're talking about here, these migration crises, which are not new. They're a continuation of a system of a pressure valve that they open and they close to their advantage. And when I say they, I'm talking about the Cuban regime. And lastly, to the embargo, the blockade. We can have that argument about its pros and cons any day. What I will say is this. The Cuban economy internally, for me to go fishing in Cuba, that's not controlled by the embargo. That's controlled by the regime. For me to have a business in Cuba, that's controlled by the internal domestic economic policy imposed on the Cuban people by a government that they have never elected. And it's the regime who does those things. It's the regime who tells you if you can open a business, if you can own a car, if you can create private wealth, if you can employ someone else, if you cannot employ someone else. So when we see the economic calamity of the Cuban people, it has nothing to do with the embargo. It has everything, absolutely everything to do with the regime. So I'm glad that we're here today. talking about these things because I believe that in my lifetime and very soon, the new generation of Cubans will be able to dictate their future. And not only that, but I think we need to talk hope into those people. What we're doing here today is part of that. They cannot be felt like they're left alone, that their only option is to leave Cuba. We need young people in Cuba, because if not, this is a continuation of the same problem. So they need to feel supported. And by that, I'm going to close because I can talk and talk. They need to feel supported. And we need to talk about, hey, tomorrow when there's a change, there's a plan to rebuild Cuba, to rebuild the civil institutions in Cuba, to rebuild a democratic system in Cuba, to rebuild the education system in Cuba, the infrastructure system in Cuba. And we, as those who care, whether we're Cuban, Cuban American, or everyday people, are willing to go and make that sacrifice to help that reality that we have vouched for so long come to life. So thank you.